All right, so we'll go ahead and get started again. I just wanted to express my thankfulness being a part of the admissions team, um, and how helpful it is to have this type of perspective. I talk to applicants all day, and they share a lot of the same concerns, and they raise a lot of the same questions that our alumni are bringing up now. So this is just such a helpful thing to have for me, I'm sure for you, but I just wanted to express that and say thank you again to all of our alumni. So we'll go ahead and get started. So our next presenter earned a PhD from the Mythological Studies program and is Director of General Education at the Relativity School in Los Angeles. He has also co-hosted a radio show that he created for the Santa Barbara News Press and Joseph Campbell Foundation, mythological roundtables called Mythosophia. Please welcome William Lin.
Thanks. Hello. Okay, so that works. It does work. So I want to tell you about how I'm a different person now than before I went to Pacifica. By that, I don't just mean employed, although I definitely also mean that. I want to I thought I'd basically just tell you the story of deciding to go to Pacifica and what it was like as I went through. It is an individuation journey, unavoidably, and so I want to share a little bit about that and where I've landed since, and how the trajectory of that path has taken me to where I am now. So when I graduated college as a philosophy major, I knew that I was looking for an interdisciplinary studies program because I was looking at philosophy. I was a philosophy major. I was looking at philosophy and didn't want to not study psychology. And then I was looking at psychology, and I didn't want to not study religion. And then I was looking at religion, and I didn't want to not write my stories. And so when I found Pacifica, of course, as with all of us, it's a synchronicity. And as with all of us, it's a story to tell. The story of how you came to Pacifica is, for many of us, a huge journey, and it's often one of the first stories we tell each other when we come. But I knew that I would need an interdisciplinary studies program, and when I found Pacifica's Myth program, an opportunity for me to study world religion, psychology, philosophy, while also, I thought, doing something better than doing an MFA program, because instead of learning to master the English language in the form of poetry or screenwriting, I wanted to master a deeper language that I thought was much more powerful. And I'm sure that some of you have. It was also around this time that I learned what the real influence was that Joseph Campbell had on Star Wars, and also so much sense. I'll give you the quick spiel for those of you who don't know. Arthur C. Clarke was given the book by Stanley Kubrick when he wrote 2001. George Lucas says he couldn't have finished Star Wars had he not found Here with a Thousand Faces. Indiana Jones was modeled after Joseph Campbell the Man by Steven Spielberg. So was Robert Langdon's, Dan Brown's Robert Langdon. And then flash forward, decades of this, and then you get to the Disney years of the 90s, where Chris Vogler has kind of adopted or adapted Here with a Thousand Faces to film. So instead of using myth examples, he's using film examples. He gets credit on Lion King and Aladdin and a bunch of these stories for bringing that the hero's journey into those movies, which has already been very much in practice and in play in a more beneath the surface way, until Chris Vogler made it very above boards, very part of the known situation in Hollywood. Now, to skip forward in my talk, I do now work at a film school, and everybody knows the hero's journey, not just in LA, but in every film industry all over the world. And now it's to the point, it's like a joke. Literally, there was a Joseph Campbell quote on Wonder Woman's sword in the last movie. There was a Joseph Campbell quote on Superman's chest or cape. I keep getting mixed up. Written in Kryptonian, of course. There was a Joseph Campbell quote in Michael Bay's, 13 Hours or whatever, 13, 14 Hours, that movie. And of course, Snowden, when he's asked in the movie, who's your biggest hero, or your biggest intellectual inspiration, his first answer is Joseph Campbell. So that was a hero's journey far beyond academics that was very valuable to many of us as American citizens. So Joseph Campbell, it was at this time, part of my call to Pacifica was learning the influence and the relationship between the study of myth and these profound works of art and stories. And I knew that I wanted to make profound works of art and tell profound stories. So it was a click. It was like no doubt in my mind. I had been at a poetry conference, and they told me that my poetry had no imagery in it. and then I read Here with a Thousand Faces, and many, many things clicked. I found Opus. And then Opus led me to Pacifica, and that was my call. And so, but from there, people said, "Are you sure? You'll be the youngest person the Myth program's ever had." And then they said, my dad. I tell my dad, I'm willing to spend all the money that you've worked so hard to save for me. I'll spend all of it for this program. And he says, "Over my dead body." And but despite these resistances in my life, I knew that I had to come here. I was very, very sure. And my response to the whole "you'll be the youngest person there" was, "Really? You mean I'm going to beat them there?" Because I knew that young people, that people in my generation would be right behind, because I knew that what Pacifica is, what the Myth program is, and what we study here is dead center for what's really important to a growing generation and an emerging generation. The interdisciplinary studies, it's very important to this era of globalization. So that was really important to me, and I identified Pacifica as a place not just to engage in academic degree, but a place to pursue wisdom, a place to be on my path towards enlightenment, whatever that was, for me. But beyond that, I was also a very fiery person with huge ambition, a lot of identification with my own persona, and I was significantly more self-interested than I'd like to admit, and certainly than I am today. But Pacifica had a lot to do with that, or had a lot to help. So when I decided that I was pretty sure I was going to come, I got on the phone with Walter O'Dinick, who some of you may know, a true mentor to me, and we had an incredible conversation. And it was then that I started to learn that Pacifica professors are not just brilliant professors. They are relatively individuated people. And I can't even tell you how valuable that is. Not just to have somebody that's brilliant, but also to have an incredible human using that brilliance to teach. The ability, the opportunity that they have to teach with the psyches that are in this place, I can't overstate how valuable it is to have not just great teachers, but great human beings as the teachers. And that experience with Walter was the beginning of a consistent experience of that here. So I left, I departed, I came, I flew from Florida, I took a huge leap of faith. I knew that I was going to have to take out the loans and do it myself, but I was very committed. And I got here, and it was in a totally different world. It was California world, which is already its own world, right? Sandwiches with, only one piece of bread, little things like that told me that I was no longer anywhere I had been before. And by the way, much of the fruit was grown here, and I was in paradise too. And this place is a paradise, and I think that many of us remember our coursework years as so fondly, is our paradisal years, those coursework years when we're coming to campus with regularity. So once I got here, I was totally inundated in the unconscious world, and the study of the unconscious, and the study of wisdom, world religions. And now, once I started going through the program, I was on this, the road of trials, courses, world religions, psychologists and theories, over and over on sequence, very fast and very intense, but total immersion and a total initiation process, not just into the depths, but also into world religion, also into the biggest stories of humanity, and consequently into my own psyche, and into cultural psyches, and into our current cultural psyche, and all these things started to change me. So I ended up at the end of this process, of course, going into a dissertation. I formed my committee, an incredible committee with Lance Smith, the head of the Myth program, Maria Tatar, who's the head of the Degrees Committee for Myth and Folklore at Harvard, and Kieran Legrees, who is the Archetypal Studies, who runs the Archetypal Studies degree here, and was extremely excited. Oh, I skipped a step. I've got two, like my notes. I just totally left the whole thing. Let me come back to the dissertation. I'm sorry. Biggest move, the next big thing, was to come out here and live with 5 to 8, depending on how many were crashing on our couch, mythology PhDs in Ojai. And it was an incredible situation. We were on about 5 acres of land with over 20 types of fruit trees, stone's throw from a child, like a swimming hole right out of the childhood imagination, incredible. And so we were so excited. Here we are, all these young mythologists ready to take on the world. Let's do it. It's time to make a change. Let's do some amazing stuff. And of course, my ambition had not slowed, and my persona was still quite in charge. And so what happened was not what any of us hoped. Actually, there was a lot of tension. There's a lot of deconstruction of ourselves, of our own projections. I think each one of us wanted to be Peter Pan, and nobody wanted to be their lost boys. Um, and there's a lot of deconstruction. I deconstructed a whole lot, and this all culminated on a trip I took to Israel and the Vatican, and I had built it up in my mind. I'd gotten permission to delay my essays for Christianity, Islam, and Judaism mythology courses for that trip so that I could write them in the Vatican after having gone to Israel. And it was like so hyped up in my mind. And to be honest, I was trying to, willfully do something special. I was like, it's going to be a special situation. So obviously, I'm going to write something amazing. And then here I am writing, and I get into those situations. Man, I got to finish this in like 2 hours. It's not it's not that special, and but I wanted it to be. I desperately did, and of course, what happened? I didn't get A's on all those essays, and I got some negative feedback from some people I really admire, and it was consistent with the fact that when I was in Israel, expecting Israel to be Israel, like something's crazy is going to happen there. All the crazy thing that happened while I was there were my dreams of all the towers in Israel collapsing and falling. And my first reaction is, we got to get out of Israel. But then, of course, I realized in reflection that it was a lot of my own inner towers were coming down. And this was profound for me. The insight I was focused on those essays was the same that I'd focused on in my dissertation, and it's an insight of emptiness. And here I was filled with my insight of emptiness, and my insight of emptiness was not emptying me. And so what happened is I came back. I was totally changed, very changed, and relationships started to improve with my friends. We started to do some incredible stuff together, including this mythological roundtable we started. Some of the wisdom of Pacifica started to actually transition from my head into my being, because it takes this type of inner breakdown. Don't expect to come to any of these programs for an intellectual experience only. It will work on you. It has to work on you. It's part of what's so powerful here. So then I, started doing much better work. Walter, that original mentor, said, "Hey, your essays, they're not good enough, basically. You need to do some real work." And so I did, real work. And then it was a great essay. Then I moved on to the dissertation. Incredible dissertation experience, incredible feedback, but I put in real work, and it was different. It wasn't for ambition or pride. It was just the work. It was following a kind of deep emptiness that I had started to find. This is when I started to do the dissertation, the radio show, the roundtable, and at the same time I was writing a script for myself. And so something new in me was starting to finally reach an end of this gestation period and starting to be born. And I graduated. The summer I graduated, I was offered a job to chair a department. Basically, before I could even finish graduating, the Joseph Campbell Foundation hired me to do some stuff for them. And I also had a dream where I was an obsidian man. This was the last night that my family was in their family home before my parents moved out. And I remember knowing it was the last night there and an end of a chapter. And I remember thinking about Chris Downing telling us how people used to go to the Asclepion and ask for a dream and sleep there. And so this is what I did. I asked for a dream. And that night I dreamt of myself made of obsidian, and all the universe flowing through me. And I won't tell you all the backstory to why obsidian is so important to me, but it is really important to me. And so the insight that I had come in with, intellectually, I already knew before I got to Pacifica, but was not. This emptiness that I brought in with me, this focus on emptiness, hadn't actually worked on me. But by the end of this program, I actually was finally having these experiences of emptiness, and only when I could experience my own spirit, my own ego, my own persona, silent enough, then you could feel instead of this outward push, I started to feel this inward flow, this everything kind of flowing through me in this surreal way. And so then, and so now here I am chairing this department at a film school, teaching myth and story to filmmakers, actors, musical theater majors, and dancers. And I love what I do, and I love what I do for the Joseph Campbell Foundation. And not only do I love what I do, but having gone through what I've gone through, I feel like I could really do anything, and that would not have been the case. I was unemployed and couldn't find a job, and now I feel like I really could do anything I want. I could, not just chair this program. I could go into politics. I could go into marketing. I could go into any sort of strategic campaign work. I can consult on stories. Right now, I'm reading a script that's for the new Disney Sword in the Stone live action that Brian Cogman wrote. He's one of the producers and writers for Game of Thrones, and he's writing Disney's live action Sword in the Stone. And so I'm giving him feedback on this right now. There's so many things I could do. What you can do with the myth degree, you can't even begin to guess at before you start to go through it. But it really does make you somewhat of a wizard, because you can see so much of how things work. One of my great colleagues, one guy I work with, I worked for the CIA for years, is a mythologist, and he points out that going between myth and politics is seamless. So sorry about that. But that is my experience. A complete transformation. Without Pacifica, I would not have had the opportunity to go through and birth what really was in me to be born. There wouldn't have been the space, there wouldn't have been the nurturing, there wouldn't have been the reality, there wouldn't have been the mentors. You can't just do the reading. I know that some of you are wondering, could I just do the reading? You can't just do the reading. All right, anyway, that's all I have. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, William. That was great. So moving right along, our next presenter is a fifth-year student completing her PhD from the Community Psychology, Liberation Psychology, and Eco-Psychology specialization. She is the Chief Collaborative Coordinator for the Restorative Community Network, working closely with law enforcement, probation, community service providers, and the community at large. Lizzie was recently appointed to the Tenant Protection Task Force for the City of Santa Barbara. Lizzie Rodriguez.
Thank you. So a big part of what I do for work is restorative circles, restorative justice, and mediation. So like everything inside of me is holding back from saying, let's stay in a circle. So I'm going to act and speak as if we're in circle right now. And what I'd like to do first is get to know you a little bit. So I'm curious, how many people are here interested in the counseling or clinical program? And how many people are interested in the mythology program? And the community liberation and eco-psychology program? How many people are just drawn to the campus and don't know why? Okay, great. Okay, so the Community Liberation and Eco-Psych program is fairly new for Pacifica. It was the depth psychology. Everything was sort of clumped under depth, and then it was broken out into Community Liberation and Eco-Psychology, and then another strand of the Somatics program, and then another strand, which I think is the archetypal young program. So I'm going to just take us back on a journey 44 years ago. I was born in Fresno on a grape farm. My parents were migrant workers in Fresno. They were uneducated, uninsured. They were documented, but the rest of my family was not. So I come from very meager beginnings. My dad was in and out of prison still to this day. My mom had mental health and drug and alcohol dependency. So education was not something that was valued in my family. So graduating from high school was a huge achievement for my twin brother and I. My mom was only 15 when she had us, and dad was incarcerated by the time we were 1. So it was, my journey here is, I would say, untraditional. And I think that's the case for everybody coming here. It's untraditional. I was first introduced to the campus as kitchen staff. It was front of the house. So there's the back of the house, which does the cooking, and I was front of the house, so I cleaned the trays, I set out the food, I smiled at all the students that came in, and I thought to myself, I remember thinking that the campus was pretty amazing and the people that came here were pretty amazing, and they had all these conversations about things I had no idea, the words that they were saying. And I thought to myself, why is it that some people are born to be educated and to have these conversations and come to schools like this, and other people are born to serve them? And that was the beginning of my individuation. um, Paulo Freire would call that the beginning of my conscientization, or the place where I began to challenge or question the realities and the contradictions of reality. So I decided I was going to be a little bit different. I had my own drug and alcohol dependencies at that time, and was basically working to survive. And so I thought, well, these people seem somewhat normal. They seem average. Maybe I could do that. So I already had a high school diploma, which was huge in my family. And I thought, I'm going to go to City College for a bit. So I went to our local community college here and, stayed in the service industry for a while. I worked in hotels and ended up, doing pretty well for my family sort of setting. I worked in an office. I had a desk and my own extension, and I was like, doing pretty well. And there was still this draw. I lived in Santa Barbara, and there was this draw to Pacifica, and I kept questioning why is it that people get this life and other people serve? And I knew that my role was serve. So I pursued that more. I had at this point already started exploring international service work. I called it voluntourism. So I would go to different countries. I wouldn't have a plan. I would just go meet local people there, find out what the local needs were. Instead of staying in a hotel, I would stay on a couch or the floor, and serve. Looking back, I see that was probably more charity work, and it made me feel really good. But it kind of led me into a little bit more of what I'm doing now. So I started at Pacifica, and very first day of class, I am nervous because everybody's just much smarter than me, much more wiser than me. They wear ponchos and Birkenstocks, and I'm from East LA, and just didn't belong here. Didn't feel academically prepared. I found out later that most people who come straight from a bachelor's degree feel the same way. So, and we're sitting in a circle that felt very vulnerable for me. People are using these big words, and I'm just like, oh my God, I should be in the kitchen. That's where I belong. So then we're in the dining hall, first day of school, okay? All of my junior high insecurities are right up here. This larger than life classmate of mine thought I said something and was very upset. I mean, this came out of the blue. It's like assigned seating on the first day of lunch so that we can get to know each other. And so we're sitting diagonal like this. I'm here, she's here. She stands up. She's an actress. She stands up, throws her tray down, literally, and says, I have never been so insulted. And then she left. And it was like the whole dining hall turned around and stared at me. That obviously didn't happen, but it felt that way. And that was the beginning of my introduction to conflict. My dad dealt with conflict by violence and murder, so he's in prison. My mom dealt with conflict by self-destruction, drugs, alcohol, and moving a lot. So those were the only two models that I had. I didn't know how I was going to spend the next 3 years with this classmate on the first day of school who challenged me, and I didn't know why. That led me to my work today. It's so interesting because I didn't prepare for today because you can't really prepare for Pacifica. So, but on, how Facebook gives you those like reminders of like memories from the past. A year ago today, I wrote something to the effect of, why does conflict follow me? It makes my heart race. It makes my mouth dry. I could hear my heartbeat in my head if the ringing in my ear didn't stop. I mean, it was like I had such a visceral response to conflict, and that stayed with me through the 3 years here. It led me to doing post-conflict community development work, both here in Santa Barbara on a national level through the Truth Telling Project, which explores police brutality and racial injustices, and in my work in Rwanda, Burundi, the Congo, and most recently, Lebanon. So this was my vocation. I was meant to be here as the front of the house kitchen support so that I could see the conflict within economic injustice and challenge that. I was meant to come here and sit next to this person who brought my vocation to me in the most dramatic way. I was meant to then connect with a woman who was part of the Quaker organization, which I then did my first year fieldwork um, in Rwanda. So, I see it as karmically shifting the conflict relationship in my family. So I'm now able to repair harm through restorative justice work. I'm able to bring two sides together, whether it's landlords and tenants here in Santa Barbara dealing with housing issues, um, juveniles with their victims in juvenile hall, or in classroom environments through school-based restorative approaches, or in prison working with lifers who are working through how to forgive themselves after the trauma that they've inflicted on other. And then most dramatically in different countries where we're dealing with post-genocide, post-Civil War, a community healing. I don't know how much time I have, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about how. So I think there's 3 questions. What brought you here? What's your dissertation? And what are you going to do with this? Or how do you speak this language in the real world? So, stage is I'm in Rwanda I'm probably there for about 3 weeks working with victims of genocide and civil war. Most of them are returning soldiers. So they were kidnapped at an early age, were forced into militia, and then they're returning back home trying to integrate. I see that as a parallel with formerly incarcerated individuals who are trying to reintegrate into society. So I'm talking with one person in particular, Tony. He's my hero. He's 24. He was a victim of a child soldier or a militia group, actually. He was walking from school to his village. He lived in Uganda at the time. And the militia was coming in to attack his village. They grabbed him and several other of his schoolmates. They were about 9 years old at the time. And they used them as human shields so that they went in, they shot, they knew that they wouldn't get targeted back because they had these children in front of them. So Tony was left without legs. And we were doing 3 weeks of trauma training, trauma healing training. So we were training individuals to go back into their community and offer this healing work for in a more contextual way. So all of this brought up post-traumatic stress for Tony. And he was feeling the pain in his legs. But his legs weren't flesh and bone. So he had come into my my room and he's crying and he's feeling the pain and he didn't know what to do. So he came in and so we sat and we talked. We used myth. We used story. So he sat. His legs were up. I asked him to tell the story. Tell me about leg. Tell me about leg as a victim. So then he told the story about what happened to his leg. I'd already heard it, but he told it from leg's perspective. So then about 30 minutes, 40 minutes of that, I said, okay, so tell me about leg as hero. Tell me the story of leg as hero. So then he talked about how leg now is helping others who have experienced the same. How leg is now a healing link between him and the former enemy and him and victims as well. So after we talked about leg as hero, the pain stopped. That's depth psychology. That's myth. That's archetypal imagery in action. we didn't have to use, I mean, we already had a language barrier, but we didn't have to use fancy words. We didn't have to talk with the glasses like this. We just spoke from our hearts and from our soul. And so now when I think about my pain, my inner scars, I think about Leg as hero and how I can use my victim as a link for healing.
All right. Thank you, Lizzie. Thank you so much. And so on to our last presenter. After this, we'll have another short break and then bring all the presenters back for a Q&A with the panel. So please stick around for that. But our last presenter earned a PhD from the Depth Psychology program and has been department chair of the East-West Psychology program at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and a former core faculty member in the Department of Consciousness and Transformative Studies at John F. Kennedy University. He is currently the Associate Provost at Pacifica. Greg Chalquist.
Thank you. So I'm going to hop on the bandwagon of what Hillman calls, using an ancient Greek term, the daimon, which you could also translate into other languages, your soul or your innermost self. And it's a concept that occurs in all cultures, I think, by different names. And I wanted to just give you a couple of examples. Is this on? Can you hear me? A couple of examples of what seemed to be turning points that led me here, although that's not quite the right term, but you'll get what I mean as I go. And one of them is that when I tell people, this came up a little bit yesterday when we were doing process work, and when I tell people that my birth mother was an international criminal who carried a gun, and that my birth father was a highly seasoned special operations soldier who taught her how to jump out of airplanes, and that I had probably, I sometimes lose count, maybe a half dozen names before I was born, and was relinquished in a secret adoption into a violent family, the response I've often gotten over the years is that people say, wow, you had a really either adventurous life or mythic right from the very start. But one of the things I learned when I came here was that everybody is in an adventure and everybody has a mythic life right from the start. The only difference is that some of us know it because we come here and find it out in class someday, or you're unconscious of it, in which case you're apt to live it out in a symptomatic form, which isn't satisfying. So when I was a boy, there was Hillman talks a lot about following your fascinations and looking back at your childhood to see the things that you were just fixated on as clues to where you're going, because the assumption that he gets from Jung as well is that there's something deep in the unconscious, far wiser and older. Jung called it the million-year-old man, who has a sense, it's not a fixed destiny, but it's a telos, it's an impulsion toward a certain path, and possible futures, I like to think, also exist in the unconscious. And so there was this TV show that would, or actually a movie that would come on once a year, and although I was the kid in the family who was kind of the reflective one and sort of quiet and occasional acting out because of what was happening in the family, but mostly just kind of inward. But when this film came on, I would push everybody out of the way and say, TV's mine. I got to see this, right? And it was about this underwater city, advanced, inclusive, amazing, magical, and a plot that was happening with that and the fate of the world. And it was a science fiction film. And had to see it, had no idea why. Until years later, I was looking for a PhD program because the name of the underwater city was Pacifica. And I was, 6 or 7, something like that. So I was following I like to think of my daimon as a dragon. And the reason is my earliest dreams were about being pursued by dragons that were wrapped in lightning. And dragon for me it's got a specific image, and I sometimes suggest to students that you find or allow in, rather, not select consciously, some image of your innermost self, whatever you call it, and let it come into your consciousness so you can play with it a little bit. So I like to play with the dragon and ride the dragon a bit. And so fast forward to college, when I was kind of bored and in a bookstore in Thousand Oaks. I went to Cal Lutheran for my BA in psychology. But before I got to the point of knowing what my major was, I had just been kind of reading here and reading there and feeling bored one day. And I went into the bookstore and I just, at random, so to speak, grabbed a couple of books off the shelves. One of them was Karen Horney's book, Self-Analysis. And the other one was, he keeps coming up today, Abraham Maslow, The Farther Reaches of Human Nature. And that second book delighted me, mostly because of the tone. I didn't understand a word of it, but I really liked the writing, you know. And I thought, wow, this is great, you know. And I did understand Karen Horney's book because she writes so that people not trained in psychoanalysis can actually read her stuff. And the first thing I realized, and it was a huge, I was talking about this yesterday, it was like a gong went off in the back of my mind. It was a huge moment of, I have to do this. My first thought after her book was, I have to study depth psychology. And the second thought was, I'm way more neurotic than I realized. I better get into therapy, which I did for like a long time. So, God for therapy. So, I studied marriage and family therapy in grad school. Before I got there, there was the one moment in my life, I think, where I was really actively running away from my daimon. And upon leaving college, although I had the psychology degree, and I knew I wanted to be a psychotherapist, I think, but I spent some time as a technical writer in the corporate world. I got married. I married into a family with kids, and so I kind of had an instant family all of a sudden, which felt really cool. And then, but after a few years, I felt restless and like I was kind of missing my path somehow. And then I had a dream in which there was a glowing woman standing in front of me. I think now she was a goddess, possibly Sophia, the wisdom goddess. And in the dream, she was pointing at my birthmark, which I found out from when I found my birth families. My birth mother has a mark in a similar place on her arm, had. And so in the dream, the goddess was pointing at that, and she said, instead of calling me Craig, she said, hey, Cain, you're covering up your mark. And in the dream, I looked down, like, what is she talking about? And I realized that I had my hand over my birthmark. And I woke up, and I didn't know much about dreams back then. And if you work with a lot of dreams, you realize that you never are an expert. They're infinitely mysterious. And then, you know, we get bits and pieces, but I knew enough to wake up and say, this is killing me. This technical writing and being in a marriage I don't like much, and my wife has a problem with it too, and I have to move on. And that was painful, but I did it. So I studied psychotherapy, family systems. My master's degree is in marriage and family therapist, which is what I practiced for a while. And then, and again, there was a missing piece. Where's all the depth stuff that I want to do? You know, I had a great English teacher, not the psychology teacher who was a behaviorist, but an English teacher in college who said, you should read Jung. So I add Man and His Symbols to the list. That was the third book that really got my attention. So, and then I read the collected works, and then I read all of his letters that were translated, and I read the seminars, and, you know, Jung was pursuing me at that point. So I love family systems, and I continue to teach it and keep up to date on it, but there was the missing depth piece. So when I went looking for, as I was looking for graduate programs, there was, one day there was a phone call from a guy named Scott in Simi Valley, and he said, I hear you're looking for an internship, and I got something for you, but you might not like it much. And he said, I can't seem to keep a therapist with me to do this. And so I was kind of intrigued. And although I'm the quiet, reflective person, I think coming from the families that I did, gave me a sort of a streak for adventure. So I said, well, what kind of practice do you have? And he said, I work with violent men. They come out of jail or prison, and there are a big variety. Some are batterers, some are rapists, some are military guys with really bad PTSD who are violent. We have contract killers come in sometimes. We have ex-members of the Hells Angels, a really good variety, And I went, tell me more. And so the very first session, I was really nervous because it was like sitting with 12 of my dad in the same room. He had been violent for a big part of my life. But I was so blown away by the work that Scott did with these men. He was respectful but confrontive. And he was a bullshit detector. So, when men would minimize their violence or take excuses or take refuge in excuses or whatever, he would bust them immediately, but in a respectful way. And I thought, how cool that someone could do this. Because in the family I grew up in, you just hit people when you were pissed at them, right? So to actually have him do that, I was so impressed by he had a quality that I would now call kingly. And he modeled that for me. We were the same age, but he was my elder in this area of my life. So I ended up doing that for 6 years, 3 times a week. I'd trained for a year with him and co-founded Cornerstone Counseling Center in Simi as an intern. And then I went on to do my own work in Santa Barbara County, training interns and psychotherapists and in the same work. And then came here to Pacifica. And during that time, one of my teachers was Lionel Corbett. And I was starting to feel kind of not bored, but just something about the work with the men, I think, had run its course. And so I had a talk with him, and part of what you get here is, there's the lessons in class and the interactions, and as I was mentioning yesterday, there's people in your cohort who say things, and they're your teachers sometimes too. And then there's the little, I can't remember Irv Yalom's name for this, not add-ons, but like these sidebars that you get from wise teachers. And so I was mentioning to Lionel, I do these men's groups and I'm getting bored with it or whatever it was. I'm not bored, but resistant or something. And he said something that in retrospect is obvious to me. He said, well, maybe you worked through what you needed to and there's no arrows left. And I went, oh. And I was done. So I told the agency, thank you very much. And, So one thing I should mention too, though, is before I finished with that, I taught the hero's journey to the men in the men's groups. And they loved it. We had to teach them the usual things like anger management and some peace building skills, how to be assertive without being violent, things like that. And that was good. It was challenging. But the hero's journey really lit them up. So that was my first chance to actually teach a little bit of depth psychology. So I came here. I actually had the privilege of studying in 2 programs. I thought I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. And I had the psychologist part right. And that often happens too in terms of the daimon. You're in the right area, you're in the right story, but not quite. Because maybe you literalize it a little bit or something. You have your own ego level idea about it. So I had the psychologist part right, but I didn't have the clinical part right. I was actually, I think, in the clinical world for as long as I was as on-the-job training in all of this. And so I realized through going through the clinical program that I had now finished that part of my life, and I wanted to be an educator. So I changed to the depth program. While I did this, so these are all turning points of some sort, or as Lionel would call them, not so much turning points, they're course corrections along the path. So I was doing field work. I was in the program that Lizzie mentioned, the depth program before it was CLE, actually. And I was talking a lot to Mary Watkins about what should I do, and I was doing some work in San Diego. I was giving free both psychotherapy and assertiveness training to families on welfare. And that was good, and I liked doing it, but I felt the whole time like I was missing my topic. And what I didn't know, and what I can now tell my students when I have dissertation students, is that my topic was looking for me. So I began right at the end. Timing is so uncomfortable sometimes in terms of those damn academic deadlines, Right at the end, but fortunately on this side of the deadline, I started having dreams. I was back in San Diego, which is where I was born, and I had been gone for 18 years, and then I came back. And so I was getting to know the city again, and that was part of Mary's advice to me. She said, "Why don't you get to know San Diego again? You've been gone a long time, and especially the shadow, of San Diego." So I was working in the shadow of it, a little bit with the justice system, not as much as the other work. And I started having a series of dreams in which a feminine figure kept showing up and telling me things about the history and structure and geography and geology of San Diego. And I finally realized she was San Diego. And at that point, I had had some training in understanding dreams, but I had no training in the eco-psychological reality that sometimes places can show up as personified figures in your dreams and actually interact with you. And that led me into animism. And at one point, Mary said, "You should call up cellist Glendinning and talk to her about this." So I did that. I started reading and talking to as many people as I could who were aware of indigenous animistic traditions that are still alive and flourishing, although under attack by the dominant culture. Not to steal from them. I just wanted guidance. I wanted to know what they were up to so that I could go back to my own traditions and say, so where is that with us? And I found it. So that was part of the journey too, that turning point of the dreams. And I actually, years later, used dreams as a guide for what's happening in a place. The usual move is to say the dream image is about my psyche or my this or my that or my life, and that's valid to a point. But I also make the reverse move of saying, now what do these things in my life tell me about the place where I actually am, and the people who live here, and what they're going through, and the conflicts that are happening. So I ended up doing my dissertation on that, and it called for a psychoanalysis of place. And fortunately, I had Elizabeth Nelson on my committee, and when I told her I wanted to do, we're now calling this terrapsychology, looking at the psychology of place. When I told her I wanted to do a terrapsychology of California, she said, "Do you want to graduate? Because graduation's a good thing, right?" And I went, "No, yeah, I guess so." So she made me do that act of separatio, as they would say alchemically, and go, "No, I can do this much by the time I graduate." And the rest became a trilogy, the Animate California trilogy, that I published afterwards. So being here, and Mary was encouraging me, even as I was here, start writing for publication, because you're walking the path of the scholar. So you need to get your word out there. So great, I did that. What I didn't pay attention to that she told me was you also need to start teaching your ass off, even if for free, because teaching positions are scarce and hard to come by, and you need to get going on that. And so I was so consumed by my dissertation that I kind of ignored that. I did network though, and so for several months after I graduated, I wasn't able to teach, which is what I had wanted to do for, at that point, a few years. But because I was networking, somebody called me up one day, this is how it often starts, and said, at Allen Hancock College, the psychology instructor for the summer session just quit, and we need you to create a class in 2 weeks. That's the Psych 101 class. And I went, all right, I'll do it. So I taught that, and that was the beginning. Once you teach in one place, the opportunities begin to open up, but you have to keep going. There's an alchemical idea that when you're building the fire under the vessel to cook the contents of it, there are degrees of fire that you need to systematically apply over lengths of time, but you reach a point eventually where the fire sustains itself. So for years, I taught as an adjunct. I went to different schools. At one time, I was teaching at on several different campuses in the Bay Area simultaneously as an adjunct. You do what you have to do. And I was loving it, even though it was, the commute was incredible. But I loved it. But I kept banking and turning up and banking and turning up the fire. And I got to the point eventually, around the time I became core faculty at JFK, that I was beginning to be asked to teach, which takes a while sometimes. And then I started having to say no, which is where I am now. I have to turn down more teaching than I can do because I have other things to do. Along the way, I also, because of what I learned here, picked up the skills for creating a journal. And a couple of years ago on Facebook, I don't have a personal page, but I maintain a public page of Facebook, and I said, will somebody please give us an applied mythology journal, a journal that doesn't just keep myth up in the theoretical realm, or just as an abstract study, but actually talks about how we're always in a mythic situation. And the myths are recreating themselves continually in contemporary events, in politics, in religion, in finance, in social justice. Would somebody please give us something like this? Because there's nothing out there like that. And a bunch of people posted, why don't you do it? And I was, yeah, I need another project like I need another hole in my head, you know? So I resisted it for a while, and but finally went, all right. So I know like 7 people who I think are, I know really good graphic artists. I know some good editors, you know, and people with more experience than me on working on a journal. So contacted them, and we got it going after about a year of putting it together. So Imminence, the Journal of Applied Mythology, Legend, and Folklore, is now about to do its second fall publication on the topic of folklore and politics, which we think is topical. We asked former Congressman Dennis Kucinich to contribute a piece because he has a storytelling aspect to what he does. He might be able to give us one. So we'll have probably, I think, a piece by him and a number of other good articles too, and we also accept poetry and art as well. So I could be up here all day telling you professional opportunities that have opened up for me because of coming here. But what I'd rather do is just end by giving you a paraphrase rather than a quote, because I don't have it down exactly. But you know, it'll be obvious from what I told you about my background that in many ways I've been on a continual journey of coming home. Most recently coming here in March and accepting this position with great gratitude. I love being here. And so this is one more homecoming for me. Finding my birth parents was another one, and on, finding my deep ancestry through genetic research and things like that. And what that has taught me is that many times, whether we're looking for graduate education or just coming up on some other turning point, course correction, what have you, in our lives, it's also for many of us a moment of coming home or coming closer to whatever that home is for each of us. So it's an adventure in homecoming for people like me, and perhaps for some of you as well. So bear that in mind as you make decisions about where you're going to be. So the quotation comes from French activist Simone Weil. She was a Christian activist during the Second World War and actually died a martyr. She starved herself to death because she refused to eat more than the French officers and men who had been captured by the Nazis. And her body couldn't take it, and she eventually died. Before she did that, she gave us great works of the Spirit. And in one of them, I think it's Waiting on God. I think that's the name of the work. She says something like, we often feel like we're somewhere in exile down here below. We feel like Ulysses, who was captured by pirates one night and woke up in a strange and foggy land, longing for his homeland with a longing that rent his soul. Suddenly, Athena came along and opened his eyes, and he saw that he was in Ithaca, that he was home. Just so, everyone who longs indefatigably for his homeland or her homeland and is distracted neither by the sirens nor by Calypso will awaken one day and find that you are there. Thanks.
All right. Wonderful. So we'll take another quick break. Help yourself to refreshments, and it'll be about 5 minutes. So, and then we'll get the whole panel back up here. Okay. Thank you. Okay, we're back. I think maybe a few more people are coming on in. So we'll start the Q&A panel. After the Q&A panel, if anybody has any specific admissions-related questions, I'll be here to talk about that. So if you have any logistical questions, please let me know. But we'll get started with the Q&A panel, and we'll kind of open it up to you. If you have any questions, please feel free to just shout them out. I don't think you will need a microphone, but if you do, I'll come back and get you one. But the floor is yours, and please, if you have any questions for anyone, please go ahead and ask. Does anybody like to start us off?
Lizzie, I was curious about how you got that opportunity in Rwanda, how that happened.
Okay,
So it's two ways. One is practical, and one is depth magical. But keep in mind, I call myself a color-coordinated spreadsheet follower. I'm very much that kind of thinker. In the classes where they asked us to go outside and feel in nature, so outside of my way of knowing. So, so the second part you'll understand why I preface with that. I was talking to a few folks outside. One of the greatest gifts of Pacifica is when I'm faced with a choice or dilemma, I have learned to say yes and both. So I realized coming here the limitations that we placed on ourselves, and really kind of breaking through that barrier of self knows. So I started having dreams, and I wasn't a big dreamer. I mean, I went to sleep, I was grateful for the rest, and I woke up, and now I start my day with, what did you dream? What was your dream? So I started having dreams of a woman who, she was an African woman. She was very aggressive with me, very, you must. And when I ignored her in the dream and ignored her when I woke up, she would be persistent and not let me sleep until I paid attention. She told me I needed to go to Africa. First of all, she told me I needed to move from Santa Barbara to Carp because she likes the ocean and she needed to be near water. And I said, well, fine, find me a fireplace, hardwood floors. I just made the list of impossibilities, and she did. Her name is Oya. She's the goddess of transformation and storm. So she was very stormy when she came to me, and now when I see water in dream, I know she's speaking to me. So, and again, that's so not a color-coordinated spreadsheet thinker. So that was happening, and once I started to pay attention to Oya and to listen to her messages, she told me to speak it aloud, to tell people that I need to go to Rwanda, or I need to go to Africa. So then I mentioned it to a woman who is Quaker by religious choice, and she mentioned that there is a group called the African Great Lakes Initiative that does work in Rwanda. And so I started saying yes. And I also mentioned to some folks outside that when I noticed for myself that when I started following my soul as opposed to my ego or my plan, everything that needed to be in place came in place. So the 3 years that I went to Rwanda for fieldwork was all paid for by someone else through fellowship, scholarship. Now, mind you, I didn't just sit back. I wrote the grants for it, but it was entirely an outside force that really wanted me to go. So connections, listening to dream, listening to soul. I can give you the information if you want to go. Yeah.
I don't know who to direct this to, so anybody who feels they can answer it, I'd love your input. I am very interested in seeing and notice myself, patterns going on in just disparate places in like the outside world. And it's one of the things that I love about sort of Jungian thought is like looking at what's going on in like the greater world and how that affects, how that's going on within ourselves, or like as a play of like a mythic tale. And one of the things that I'm really curious about is how I often personally then struggle, like how do I organize that? If I see these patterns, like if I wanted to like write something about that, like how do I like focus it? How do I get it organized? And I'm just wondering if anybody else has had that experience, and how this program perhaps has helped them with that. Because it's something I see all the time. That's a great idea. How do I put that together? And I think that would be important for me and my thesis work.
I was originally a very scattered writer. So lot of ideas, very little ability to siphon that down into something, comprehensive. And of course, when you're beginning to write a dissertation, that doesn't really work in your favor. So throughout that, I always had generating, all of these ideas. Maybe I should go that way, maybe. And I literally reduced it down to Post-it notes, right? Just jot the idea and it would go on the wall. And it would stay there until I had the space to go back to it, And the other thing that I did was I carry a journal everywhere I go. And if something sparks, I write it down. A quote, write it down. So everything is a documentation. I mean, that's just a, kind of off the cuff, easy response, but.
Thanks. Thanks for this opportunity to answer this question, actually. I have a few answers. One is that through the programs, any of the programs are very archetypal, and through it, any of them will so expose you to patterns that the patterns that you're seeing now will become uncomparably more clear to you, and as they become more clear, you have more command of them. So like here's my talk that I prepared this morning, and the way that I do pattern the hero's journey. This is the way that I pattern the hero's journey. It's but the other thing is self-organization, which I should let Joe talk about. But I think that that one other thing that will happen is that so there's willful organization, and that's mastery. And the more we're familiar with the forms, the more power we have to use them, and it's really liberating to have form, to have a net to play tennis with, right? Robert Frost points out. But then there's something else. There's also this self-organizing principle, and where we have to kind of let go and trust and let it happen. And it's really, 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 really hard, and we never do it willfully or willingly normally, but it normally does happen. And so to me, I think that a big response is self-organization, that these patterns do want to self-organize. And the more we can get our own will, consciousness, ego, intelligence out of the way and just be still, then it shows itself, I think. That's my experience. I don't know, I hope that helps.
You'll be writing a lot. So you'll have a lot of time a lot of opportunity to take all of those pattern ideas and put it into a paper. Yeah. And then you'll be able to kind of sort of pick out the ones that fire you, or you might even start to see themes within the patterns, and then you might just throw it all away and start all over again. But you'll have a lot of writing to do, so you can explore those patterns. Yeah.
Texted me unsolicited advice about hearing that I was here. And she said something about make sure you know the full deal of what it takes to become an MFT in terms of the hours post-graduation. Could anybody talk about that?
Yes. So our Master's in Counseling Psychology program prepares students for one of two licenses, the MFT or the LPCC. 3,000 hours are required for both. Here's the minor difference. The LPCC hours, you need 280 direct service hours while you're a student. Those hours don't count towards licensure after you graduate. You have to do 3,000 starting from zero. The MFT hours, you can log up to 1,300 while you're a student. So you need the same 280 direct service hours or 300 total while you're in practicum. So that's clients that you're seeing while you're also doing coursework in your second year. But then up to 1,300 hours can be counted towards your license. So you would have an additional 1,700 up to 2,700 remaining post-graduation, and people get those in all manner of ways. In my experience, I was able to find a position that was paid. So you're getting close to 40 hours a week working in a paid position, which may or may not be where you'd like to end up ultimately, but it can either be an extension of your internship or another position altogether, and I am very grateful for that experience. As I mentioned in my presentation, seeing clients or working in that space 35 hours a week isn't something that I do very well. I'm naturally more of an introvert, and it just takes a lot out of me. So I do have a private practice now, but it's a small private practice, and I think that balance between private practice and teaching works really well for me. But people find all sorts of different balances, and I certainly know people who do work, a 35-hour week and just see people back to back, and they're fabulous at it. But I hope that answers your question in terms of the licensing requirement.
It does. I have another question now, but
Okay.
how long did it take you to fulfill your hours to become licensed?
That's an excellent question. So, yes, I took a little detour in there because my first child was born 2 years after I finished the degree program. So I had just a handful of hours remaining, and I could have tried to push through and get it done, but I ended up completing my license after he was born. So it was 2 years basically after. If you only had 1,700 hours remaining, you could push through in a little over a year and then go from there. It just depends on sort of if you want to take the slow boat or the fast boat in terms of completing those hours after you graduate.
I'm sorry, this is leading to more questions, but it's, what she mentioned is that it's hard to find a paying job, right? And you said you were grateful to find one. What do you think the percentage, or do you think that going to Pacifica will help us in securing a paid position? Do you think that Pacifica carries a reputation that would really help in that, or?
I think you'll absolutely be prepared to find a paid position in the field if you would like one. You will have a master's from an accredited program. You will have also, and this is the value of Pacifica, I think, versus another program. Angela Mohan, who teaches the law and ethics course in our program, used to go to the consortium meetings. I also now go to those meetings, but she hobnobs with all the site directors and the practicum sites, and someone came up to her at one of these meetings and she said, "Pacifica, you're from Pacifica. I don't know what it is you all are doing over there, but I feel like I need to find out, because all of the students that we've received from you know how to be with someone in the room, and that's something that I can't teach." So as a site director, I think that's really valuable. So on paper, are you more valuable than another person coming out of a master's program? Perhaps not. You will have those qualifications, but in terms of being able to sit with someone in the room, or what got me that paid position was the interview process, where I was given a vignette, which was exactly the same as what we had to do in our oral exam process. We were given a vignette, and I had to give the legal and ethical issues, and I had to go through a treatment plan, and I had to use recovery model principles to be client-centered and come up with something that was really for the client instead of for me. And that skill, I think, will serve you incredibly well out in the workforce.
Also, Rose City Center, I don't know if you plan on going the private practice route, but Rose City Center is in Pasadena, and they are now opening themselves up to MFTs, MFT practicum and intern students. So that used to not be the case. It used to just be all pre and postdoc, or mostly postdoc work, and then pre-doc. So, and that's a paid position. And if you're looking for an eventual private practice, you get to take your patients with you once you become licensed. And they are very psychoanalytic. So if you're interested in psychoanalytic training, that would be a good site to go to. And they love Pacifica students, so yeah.
I think this ties into both of your questions. One of the benefits of having the structure that Pacifica has is professors are not required to teach a certain amount of classes. They come in from all over the country, sometimes all over the world. So your contacts are everywhere. So whether it's a clinical position, in Minnesota, or a possible fieldwork placement, the professors are all over, and the students are all over. So that brings a richness to to experience and resources and referrals.
Is offering 3 paid positions to Pacifica graduates from the counseling program because we value at the art school the unique substance Pacifica brings to that. So we specifically sought out Pacifica graduates through Counseling West to be our counselors at our school, and we pay them. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Thank you. That's something that escaped my awareness in that moment. But if you look at our pass rates for the MFT exam in California, we are always above and beyond the national or the statewide pass rate by not just a couple of points, but by 15%. Or I mean, it's always well above and beyond. Most of our students pass the first time through. Almost all. If they're taking it a second time. And that was my experience also, is that I was very well prepared for passing the licensing exam. And as we've moved into a paradigm now where there's a separate law and ethics exam and then a clinical exam. So we just overhauled the last clinical practice course so that it would mirror that law and ethics exam, so that you have sort of a practice doing that before you go out into the world and take it again. So we're definitely set up for that. And thank you, Joe. Yes, that is a big deal, and something that my husband's grandfather, who is a psychologist and has been through his whole professional career. I won't go into his whole story because we don't have time for that. But he asked me that question when I was going to Pacifica. He said, "Well, you should look up the pass rate for the national or for the state exam, because I don't know that I've heard of that school. You should check." And I went and I checked and I said, well, they're doing better than most people. So that was great to know.
And the same thing for clinical psychology. We have a really good pass rate in the state of California. And I'm scheduled to take my exam in November. So, and I feel well prepared. Yeah.
On to this question, are there any students that have been able to log a significant amount of hours during their time at Pacifica?
Yeah. Well, I don't know about the master's, but in the doctoral, yeah. Yeah, in fact, I had so many hours that I was encouraged to not submit all of them to the board so that I wouldn't get audited. Because I was at Rose City for 3.5 years. And I started as a practicum student, and then I stayed there. So, because it's just wonderful training. So I only submitted half of those hours. The rest were just experience.
I think I'm the only master's. Yes? Okay. Yes, in the master's program, there are many students who cap out the 1,300 hours and then close their practicum files at that time. So yeah, they're leaving with just the 1,700 left to complete. Yeah.
Another question. What can you expect to make as pre-licensure if you are paid? What's the range? I'm sure that it completely varies, but and compared to versus what you can make post-licensure, is it there a big difference?
There may be a slight difference, but for example, at LaVie Counseling Center, we have maybe 4 psychologists, 3 psych assistants who are all doctoral students or graduates, and then the rest are MFTs and MFT interns. So anyone who comes to our clinic, it's a sliding scale, but it's not. So our practicum students, let's say they might, it ranges from $40 to $275 an hour. That's the short of it. So depending on your education, your experience, your background, what you feel your fee comfortably, should be, that's the range. So 40 typically is the practicum, and then it goes up from there.
I have a question. Maybe everyone else knows the answer, but I don't want to be a licensed psychotherapist, but I do want to work with clients, and I want that to be legal. So I want to know if there's what are the limitations in California PhD. Can I sit with a circle like Liz does and be a circle coordinator and work with people's personal stories, psychological stuff comes up. What am I allowed to do in that circle? And who audits that? Like, where can I do it? Where can't I do it? Lots of questions in there.
So one of the benefits of not doing a clinical program is being able to offer services with a wider girth, not being constrained. So I think there's some, like, you're not supposed to touch your patients or something like that. And so I have a lot more flexibility on how I do my work, and insurance won't pay me as, like Blue Cross or Blue Shield won't pay me, but I have a contract with the schools, I have a contract with the prisons, I have a contract with juvenile probation, and juvenile hall. I get my own limited liability insurance, so it's a business, and I charge we negotiate that fee. And if I wanted to, which I do, I take youth out to the open space, and I just have a lot more flexibility. It just depends on how you feel most comfortable. And that's, I think, a lot of folks in my particular cohort, they were trying to figure out what was the more responsible decision, like doing the clinical route or doing the more a psychologist route. And I found for community work, I get a lot more credibility not being a therapist, because the folks I work with tend to not want to be pathologized.
That's what I'm seeing in my group. It's mostly people who have never been to a therapist. I work online with people already as a spiritual counselor. They're coming to me because I'm a spiritual counselor, not a therapist.
Yeah.
They want a different kind of support. So I want to continue that. But I do get a lot of people in trauma, all caught in family drama. So I have questions about what my liability.
There's a practical response to that too, in that there are some restrictions, at least here in California, that you cannot, for instance, you cannot call yourself a therapist legally. And it helps, I think, to build a wide net of referrals, because getting those clients that do cross that boundary of your skill set, they do need to be referred out, so you need to have that in your back pocket, so to speak.
I have a question about the definition of in-depth psychology. What do you mean by in-depth? In-depth. What is meant by that?
That's your first year class. And then you'll be asked about that in your oral exam. Who wants to talk about what depth psychology is?
I thought for a second you were saying in depth rather than depth. Depth, yeah. Yeah, when Hillman was still around, he would come here and he would sit with students, and he'd look at them and kind of do his old man scowl thing to intimidate them a little bit, and he'd go, "What is depth?" And then they'd spend like 2 hours on that. So many different ways to come at this. If you wanted a really perhaps dictionary definition, that kind of thing, then you could say that it's the research and practices and traditions that look at and that study the relationship between conscious and unconscious, but that's such a minimalist way of looking at it. When I was being taught by Mary Watkins, one of the things she emphasized was that depth psychology welcomes in what's been exiled to the margins of both culture and consciousness. Hillman would probably say something like, when we go below the surface of, for instance, everyday events or our ego-level explanations for what we do, and we look at the underlying fantasies and images and affects below that, then we're in the realm of depth. Or when you make the move of being in a situation or perhaps reading the news and suddenly seeing that there's a myth being repeated unconsciously, then you've made the shift from daylight consciousness, or what Jung calls the spirit of the times, to the spirit of the depths. And as I mentioned yesterday, I can't imagine even going through my life now not having those lenses. I don't always know what the myth is or what the image is, but you develop a feeling for it and you go, oh, okay, so this is like those old stories where you're out in the countryside somewhere following the red boar or the deer or whatever it is, and suddenly you're in the other world. So, others?
You pass.
And there it's like a circle, and there's a line between the circle, and then you've got the conscious, and then you have the subconscious. And so we're delving into the subconscious about why a person is acting a way that he actually doesn't consciously know why he's acting this way, but it's buried in depth.
Yeah, so we're positing that the unconscious is sort of alive and awake and at work in the world simultaneously. This is a present force. And I was just going to add that with everything Craig said, and you probably resonated with some of these things, a lot of our students come in and they go, okay, what is depth? And we have the first year course and we talk about what is depth, and there's a lot of conversation around it. But when we ask students to think about things through a depth lens or take a depth perspective, these questions will come up a lot. And sometimes they have difficulty doing that because many of the people who are drawn to our programs are already seeing the world through that lens. So it's almost like asking you to take off the depth glasses in order to look at the glasses and say, what is this lens I've been looking through? But you've been wearing them maybe your whole life, the last 20 years, a significant portion of your reality. So when we say, it's imagining that all of these forces are important and that they're at play in the world, you're like, well, isn't that sort of obvious? That doesn't sound like a special kind of psychology. That sounds like just the way things are. Like, yes, well, it's not for everyone that this is the way things are, or that's not an obvious assumption. So we say depth psychology, and then we define it as Craig did, I think, very nicely from the minimalist to some of the broader concepts. But it may be something that you're already living with. And
Understand, which makes sense because this is synchronous.
yeah, exactly.
And just to add to that, and it looks different in different contexts as well. For example, I consider myself an integrated or integrative depth psychologist. So in the college arena, the work looks a lot different. Typically, I'm helping students either integrate parts of themselves, challenge and confront certain persona that they're operating from. A lot of, especially some of the students I was working with at Oxy, there's a lot of pressure to excel. There's a lot of pressure to do well. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of expectation from families and so forth. And so to help people deconstruct, and you were using that word earlier today, deconstruct parts of who they have learned themselves to be, and then who they naturally are, who they're actually called to be. And paying attention to that, and paying attention to their shadow material as well, and welcoming that into the room. The dark parts, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it, if you will. So, and then in clinical practice, at least at LaVie, we can look at depth work from a variety of different perspectives. The client there is typically an adult and a little more mature as far as the capacity for insight and the capacity to reflect on, things within them, tensions within relationships. It's a very relational perspective that we have at LaVie. It's very what we call intersubjective. And I could talk to you a lot about that, but it looks different in different contexts depending on the client, but it's certainly looking at conscious and unconscious behaviors and thoughts and what that looks like.
not to keep adding to this question, but I noticed that you raised your hand because you're interested in the mythology program, and I think so. Answering the question, what is depth in the context of your interest in mythology, is probably a bit, I wanted to do that because I also came here for mythology, and depth psychology. It was something I wouldn't have even known the term. I knew Jung, I knew unconscious, and that was interesting to me. Not why I came for mythology. So to speak specifically to you who's interested in mythology, what is depth and what does it do for the program? The image you're talking about is like this, only I add this piece because I do. But it is that image, and depth psychology, one of the big theories of Jung's is individuation, and individuation is really one of the cores of the hero's journey of Campbell's, and what Campbell's really looking at and what Jung was really looking at, that both of them were looking for a consistent pattern in world mythologies that was at once a plot pattern, externalized, but also an internal pattern. And so depth psychology is valuable to mythology insofar as it is what enables you to track the inner patterns, the inner process as you go through the myth. And so depth psychology for mythology brings myth, the study of myth, into the study of consciousness, the study of soul, the study of self. And I just wanted to add that little note to contextualize it to mythology for you.
And that is an area that I'm really interested in because from an African American's point of view, the mythology is missing, at least in the mainstream. And as I started doing my own research, looking for the mythology and the stories or why I act a certain way, I don't really have those heroes or that that background story. And something was written here about you need to have a story in order to know who you are and where you're going or have a vision, something to that effect. That's what so that's why I was calling to the mythology/religion.
There's a book that might be interesting to you. Have you heard of, I think his name is Clyde Ford's Hero with an African Face? It's a really cool book. He's looking at Hero of the Thousand. He's looking at the hero's journey, but specifically trying to bring African mythologies into it, and specifically for African Americans. He tells his own personal story of not really having a myth to identify with, and so he goes on a quest to find those myths for himself. Incredibly valuable, and I think that what's being said with the whole you have to know your story thing, the whole point is like, it's not that you have to externalize some story and be something. It's more so you're looking for what's the right mirror for me to understand myself through. Oh, I think it's Clyde Ford, but the book is Hero with an African Face.
So I'm on the committee. I'm the student representative for the Diversity and Inclusion Council. So I'll speak on the diversity aspect. One of the main critiques of depth psychology by liberation psychologists and indigenous psychologists is it's Western focused. So the next step, we are in the period of like the frontier of how to globalize depth psychology, so it's not just colonizing this one, like everybody has the same myth that's called the hero's journey. That's how we see it here in this context, but it may look differently. There's the individuation process, or the coming of age process, or the what is it called, like the vision quest. There are different types of rituals and different names. Religion is even an area where you can say that there are different myths. The story or the thread is similar. So I think, in all honesty, as a student of color, you may see that there is a lot of Western, a lot of white, a lot of male authors, and it's one of the areas that Pacifica is improving in. But we also need to hear the voice of the students and the new, younger faculty who are coming in with another perspective to offer more critique, more references. But in all honesty, I think that's going to be an area that will be a struggle in other depth-oriented schools as well, is crossing the threshold of globalizing, not colonizing, but globalizing the understanding of depth psychology. And for those who are interested in community work, the way the depth perspective in community work is, here's an example. Last year, I was speaking with the chief of police in Santa Barbara. We were trying to figure out how to link the Surge, the Standing Up for Racial Justice group, Black Lives Matter, Equality SB, and law enforcement to address use of force, implicit bias trainings, and she was expressing that a lot of the frustration that was coming out, or a lot of the accusations and attacks, were based on things that were happening somewhere else on a national level, not what was happening on a local level. And so we talked about the psychology of the oppressed. We talked about how, when things happen on a global or national level, it affects the psyche of the individual. That when the collective is experiencing something, it affects the psyche of the individual. And when individuals are experiencing something, it affects the collective psyche. So that is depth psychology in practice on a social community level.
I could have a very, very long conversation with you about this, so I'm gonna I'll be brief and just say that, you know, from a depth perspective, particularly from an African American experience, there are many myths that we're living by and with that need to be challenged, need to be examined, need to be confronted, need to be altered. Some of the work that I have found myself doing is going into some relatively large, primarily African American churches and integrating depth work with psychology, with spirituality, and that they don't have to be mutually exclusive. I have found that there is a fear in certain churches in particular, that a fear of psychology, or fear that psychology is somehow challenging the authority of the spiritual leader, or the pastor, or the priest, or what may have you. And so, and this is a problem, because there's a lot of people within the African American community that need help and need services, and don't have access to it because of these fears, or because of these misunderstandings or misrepresentations. So I find myself very alive in those arenas, sitting on panels similar as this, in a community where they're not used to what is depth, and so and how can that help me in my community and the people that are around me. So we can have a much different or longer conversation about it, but it looks many different ways. But that's also one thing.
Well, that is the angle that I'm coming from, because I come from a Pentecostal, very superstitious, afraid of everything, afraid of questioning anything and everything. And then on my own journey, then I found a lot of the African myth regarding Ma'at, Set. There's a whole bunch of African gods and goddesses that have been left out of this whole arena. And as a child growing up, I would have loved to have learned about these wonderful gods and goddesses, and not that this blonde, blue-eyed person who never answered my prayers anyway. Just never did. But my mother was a Pentecostal minister, and so it just took a long time for me to get rid of that fear and to be able to look at this from a different perspective, and then to start. So that's another long story, but I understand what you're talking about. Yes, that's why I like the mythology area as well as looking at religion.
Yeah. You know, I was actually envious of the depth course, the people who got the PhD in depth psychology. I was a little envious of their course curriculum, because they're studying so many things that I wish they included in the clinical psychology program. But one of the things that that really resonated with me and stays with me since graduating from the program is the ability to use metaphor and to understand, you know, symbolically what something means to someone or to a community. You know, why that image was so present for you very early in your identity development, and how to look at that from an individual perspective, a community perspective, a global perspective, a Western perspective. So it will open you up to so many different ways of thinking about this and talking about it.
Great question.
A couple of things to add to what everybody, including Lizzie, was just saying about the transition that we're making here. I wanted to mention a couple of books. One is by an author who's now a faculty member here, Fanny Brewster, and it's called African Americans in Jungian Psychology. And I have a book coming out called Myths Among Us that has more than 100 myths in it from different cultures, retold by me, but it has some European myths in it, but not primarily. And there's also a section in it called the post-heroic journey. So if anyone's interested in that, they might want to see it. I grew up in, you might have inferred from what I said earlier, on both the birth and adoptive side, families full of people that identified as heroes. So from the start, I was questioning this psychology as a good model. Campbell means it in a somewhat different sense, as somebody who strives for individuation. But I've had to do a lot of wrestling with the figure of the hero and try to come to terms with it. And that pushed me into stories that come from many different cultures that move in different directions, that the hero is just one model. And there are many others. And you can see that in the stories of many lands. I think we need to wrap up here, yeah? And so I just wanted to leave you actually with one thought. And if you have more questions, I'll be here for a few more minutes. And maybe some of you will too, if you can, just for a minute, so we can answer them. But I wanted to suggest that what's a good way to say this quickly? So there, as you know now, there are some programs at Pacifica that have a fairly clear career outcome. So if you take the MA in counseling psychology, it's because you want to do therapy with people. Clinical psych as well. There are also other programs here that do not have a clear career outcome, and there's a reason for that. Those programs offer an array of skills, ideas, perceptions, scholarship, things like this, that apply to many different possible career outcomes. So that's something to bear in mind, particularly in our day when we're facing so much turbulence with Earth itself as it overheats. Politically, if you're watching the news, if you're scared, that's probably a good reaction. There's an ecologist I know, Stephen Harding, who likes to tell people, if you're watching the news and you're not upset, you need to go to therapy to figure out why you're not upset, right? He's such a doomer, and he's true, and he's right too. So there's a lot happening, and what's required of the work that we do in the world going forward, and it's on our doorstep now, is an ability to be imaginative, flexible, inclusive, diversity-minded, and many other things that you can learn here. I wanted to add too that I'm thinking of one of my teachers here who often says, when we talk about career, we also, and this word came up earlier, we need to be thinking not just about making money, but service. And this, I didn't mention this in my piece, but I'll bring it up now, that has always been at the forefront of my thinking about where I need to go in order to make a living. How can I serve? Not just myself, but each other, our relationships, and the soul of the world and our communities. So I would venture to say, based on a lot of experience here and other places, that if you come at the idea of career from the orientation of how can I serve, you will find what you need. And the world needs you, whether you serve it in a very introverted and internal way or more through outreach and community work, either way, or some combination of the two. So thank you for being here with us.